Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 4, On the Banks of Plum Creek. Chapter 21, Nellie Oleson. Jack was waiting to meet them at the ford that night, and at supper they told Pa and Ma all about school. When they said they were using teacher's slate, Pa shook his head. They must not be beholden for the loan of a slate. Next morning he took his money out of the fiddle box and counted it. He gave Mary a round silver piece to buy a slate.
"There's plenty of fish in the creek,"
he said.
"We'll hold out till wheat harvest."
"There'll be potatoes pretty soon, too," said Ma. She tied the money in a handkerchief and pinned it inside Mary's pocket. Mary clutched that pocket all the way along the prairie road. The wind was blowing. Butterflies and birds were flying over the waving grasses and wild flowers. The rabbits loped before the wind, and the great clear sky curved over it all. Laura swung the dinner pail and hippity hopped. In town, they crossed dusty Main Street and climbed the steps to Mr. Olson's store. Pa had said to buy the slate there. Inside the store, there was a long board counter. The wall behind it was covered with shelves, full of tin pans and pots and lamps and lanterns and bolts of colored cloth. By the other wall stood plows and kegs of nails and rolls of wire, and on that wall hung saws and hammers and hatchets and knives. A large, round, yellow cheese was on the counter, and on the floor in front of it was a barrel of molasses and a whole keg of pickles and a big wooden box full of crackers and 2 tall wooden pails of candy. It was Christmas candy, 2 big pails of it. Suddenly, the back door of the store burst open, and Nellie Oleson and her little brother Willie came bouncing in. Nellie's nose wrinkled at Laura and Mary, and Willie yowed at them. Yeah, long-legged snipes." "Shut up, Willie," Mr. Oleson said. But Willie did not shut up. He went on saying, "Snipes, snipes." Nellie flounced by Mary and Laura and dug her hands into a pail of candy. Willie dug into the other pail. They grabbed all the candy they could hold and stood cramming it into their mouths. They stood in front of Mary and Laura, looking at them, and did not offer them even one piece. "Nellie, you and Willie go right back out of here," Mr. Oleson said. They went on stuffing candy into their mouths and staring at Mary and Laura. Mr. Oleson took no more notice of them. Mary gave him the money, and he gave her the slate. He said, "You'll want a slate pencil, too. Here it is, 1 penny. Nellie said, "They haven't got a penny." "Well, take it along and tell your pa to give me a penny next time he comes to town," said Mr. Oleson. "No, sir, thank you," Mary said. She turned around, and so did Laura, and they walked out of the store. At the door, Laura looked back, and Nellie made a face at her. Nellie's tongue was streaked red and green from the candy. "My goodness," Mary said. "I couldn't be as mean as that Nellie Oleson." Laura thought, I could be meaner to her than she is to us if Ma and Pa would let me." They looked at their slate's smooth, soft gray surface and its clean, flat wooden frame cunningly fitted together at the corners. It was a handsome slate, but they must have a slate pencil. Pa had already spent so much for the slate that they hated to tell him they must have another penny. They walked along soberly till suddenly Laura remembered their Christmas pennies. They still had those pennies that they had found in their stockings on Christmas morning in Indian Territory. Mary had a penny, and Laura had a penny, but they needed only 1 slate pencil. So they decided that Mary would spend her penny for the pencil, and after that she would own half of Laura's penny. Next morning they bought the pencil, but they did not buy it from Mr. Oleson. They bought it at Mr. Beadle's store and post office, where Teacher lived, and that morning they walked on to school with Teacher. All through the long, hot weeks they went to school, and every day they liked it more. They liked reading, writing, and arithmetic. They liked spelling down on Friday afternoons. And Laura loved recess, when the little girls rushed out into the sun and wind, picking wildflowers along the prairie grasses and playing games. The boys played boys' games on one side of the schoolhouse, the little girls played on the other side, and Mary sat with the other big girls, ladylike, on the steps. The little girls always played Ring Around a Rosie because Nellie Oleson said to. They got tired of it, but they always played it, till one day, before Nellie could say anything, Laura said, "Let's play Uncle John. Let's," the girls said, taking hold of hands. But Nellie grabbed both hands full of Laura's long hair and jerked her flat to the ground. "No, no," Nellie shouted. "I want to play Ring Around a Rosie." Laura jumped up and her hand flashed out to slap Nellie. She stopped it just in time. Pa said she must never strike anybody. "Come on, Laura," Christy said, taking her hand. Laura's face felt bursting and she could hardly see, but she went circling with the others around Nellie. Nellie tossed her curls and flounced her skirts because she had her way. Then Christy began singing and all the others joined in. "Uncle John is sick abed. What shall we send him?" "No, no, Ring Around a Rosie," Nellie screamed, "or I won't play." She broke through the ring and no one went after her. "All right, you get in the middle, Maud," Christy said. They began over. "Uncle John is sick abed. What shall we send him? A piece of pie, a piece of cake, apple and dumpling. What shall we send it in? A golden saucer. What shall we send it by? The governor's daughter. If the governor's daughter ain't at home, who shall we send it by?" Then all the girls shouted, "By Laura Ingalls." Laura stepped into the middle of the ring and they danced around her. They went on playing Uncle John till teacher rang the bell. Nellie was in the schoolhouse, crying, and she said she was so mad that she was never going to speak to Laura or Christy again. But the next week, she asked all the girls to a party at her house on Saturday afternoon. She asked Christy and Laura especially.
Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 4, On the Banks of Plum Creek. Chapter 22, Town Party. Laura and Mary had never been to a party and did not quite know what it would be like. Ma said it was a pleasant time that friends had together. After school on Friday, she washed their dresses and sunbonnets. Saturday morning, she ironed them fresh and crisp. Laura and Mary bathed that morning, too, instead of that night. "You look sweet and pretty as posies," Ma said when they came down the ladder, dressed for the party. She tied on their hair ribbons and warned them not to lose them. "Now be good girls," she said, "and mind your manners." When they came to town, they stopped for Cassie and Christy. Cassie and Christy had never been to a party either. They all went timidly into Mr. Olson's store, and Mr. Olson told them, "Go right on in." So they went past the candy and pickles and plows to the back door of the store. It opened, and there stood Nellie all dressed up and Mrs. Olson asking them in. Laura had never seen such a fine room. She could hardly say, "Good afternoon, Mrs. Olson," and "Yes, ma'am," and "No, ma'am." The whole floor was covered with some kind of heavy cloth that felt rough under Laura's bare feet. It was brown and green, with red and yellow scrolls all over it. The walls and the ceiling were narrow, smooth boards fitted together with a crease between them. The table and chairs were of a yellow wood that shone like glass, and their legs were perfectly round. There were colored pictures on the walls. "Go into the bedroom, girls, and leave your bonnets," Mrs. Olson said in a company voice. The bedstead was shiny wood, too. There were two other pieces of furniture. One was made of drawers on top of each other, with two little drawers sitting on its top, and two curved pieces of wood went up and held a big looking glass between them. On the top of the other stood a china pitcher and a big china bowl, and a small china dish with a piece of soap on it. There were glass windows in both rooms, and the curtains of those windows were white lace. Behind the front room was a big lean-to with a cook stove in it, like Ma's new one, and all kinds of tin pots and pans hanging on the walls. All the girls were there now, and Mrs. Olson's skirts went rushing among them.
Laura wanted to be still and look at things, but Mrs. Oleson said, "Now, Nellie, bring out your playthings." "They can play with Willie's playthings," Nellie said. "They can't ride on my velocipede," Willie shouted. "Well, they can play with your Noah's Ark and your soldiers," said Nellie, and Mrs. Oleson made Willie be quiet. The Noah's Ark was the most wonderful thing that Laura had ever seen. They all knelt down and squealed and shouted and laughed over it. There were zebras and elephants and tigers and horses, all kinds of animals, just as if the picture had come out of the paper-covered Bible at home. And there were 2 whole armies of tin soldiers with uniforms painted bright blue and bright red. There was a jumping jack. He was cut out of thin, flat wood. Striped paper trousers and jacket were pasted on him, and his face was painted white with red cheeks and circles around his eyes, and his tall cap was pointed. He hung between 2 thin red strips of wood, and when you squeezed them, he danced. His hands held on to twisted strings. He would turn a somersault over the strings. He would stand on his head with his toe on his nose. Even the big girls were chattering and squealing over those animals and those soldiers, and they laughed at the jumping jack till they cried. Then Nellie walked among them, saying, "You can look at my doll." The doll had a china head with smooth red cheeks and red mouth. Her eyes were black, and her china hair was black and waved. Her wee hands were china, and her feet were tiny china feet in black china shoes. "Oh," Laura said. "Oh, what a beautiful doll. Oh, Nellie, what is her name?" "She's nothing but an old doll," Nellie said. "I don't care about this old doll. You wait till you see my wax doll." She threw the china doll in a drawer, and she took out a long box. She put the box on the bed and took off its lid. All the girls leaned around her to look. There lay a doll that seemed to be alive. Real golden hair lay in soft curls on her little pillow. Her lips were parted, showing 2 tiny white teeth. Her eyes were closed. The doll was sleeping there in the box. Nellie lifted her up, and her eyes opened wide. They were big blue eyes. She seemed to laugh. Her arms stretched out, and she said, "Mama." "She does that when I squeeze her stomach," Nellie said. "Look." She punched the doll's stomach hard with her fist, and the poor doll cried out, "Mama." She was dressed in blue silk. Her petticoats were real petticoats trimmed with ruffles and lace, and her panties were real little panties that would come off. On her feet were real little blue leather slippers. All this time, Laura had not said a word. She couldn't. She did not think of actually touching that marvelous doll, but without meaning to, her finger reached out toward the blue silk. "Don't you touch her!" Nellie screeched. "You keep your hands off my doll, Laura Ingalls!" She snatched the doll against her and turned her back so Laura could not see her putting her back in the box. Laura's face burned hot, and the other girls did not know what to do. Laura went and sat on a chair. The others watched Nellie put the box in a drawer and shut it. Then they looked at the animals and the soldiers again and squeezed the jumping jack. Mrs. Oleson came in and asked Laura why she was not playing. Laura said, "I would rather sit here, thank you, ma'am." "Would you like to look at these?" Mrs. Oleson asked her, and she laid 2 books in Laura's lap. "Thank you, ma'am," Laura said. She turned the pages of the books carefully. One was not exactly a book. It was thin, and it had no covers. It was a little magazine, all for children. The other was a book with a thick, glossy cover, and on the cover was a picture of an old woman wearing a peaked cap and riding on a broom across a huge yellow moon. Over her head, large letters said, "Mother Goose." Laura had not known there were such wonderful books in the world. On every page of that book there was a picture and a rhyme. Laura could read some of them. She forgot all about the party. Suddenly Mrs. Oleson was saying, "Come, little girl, you mustn't let the others eat all the cake, must you?" "Yes, ma'am," Laura said. "No, ma'am." A glossy white cloth covered the table. On it was a beautiful sugar white cake in tall glasses. "I got the biggest piece," Nellie shouted, grabbing a big piece out of that cake. The others sat waiting until Mrs. Oleson gave them their pieces. She put each piece on a china plate. "Is your lemonade sweet enough?"
Miss Oleson asked. So Laura knew that it was lemonade in the glasses. She had never tasted anything like it. At first it was sweet, but after she ate a bit of the sugar white off her piece of cake, the lemonade was sour. But they all answered Mrs. Oleson politely, "Yes, thank you, ma'am." They were careful not to let a crumb of cake fall on the tablecloth. They did not spill one drop of lemonade. Then it was time to go home, and Laura remembered to say, as Ma had told them to, "Thank you, Mrs. Oleson. I had a very good time at the party." So did all the others. When they were out of the store, Christy said to Laura, "I wish you'd slapped that mean Nellie Oleson." "Oh, no, I couldn't," Laura said, "but I'm going to get even with her." "Shh, don't let Mary know I said that." Jack was waiting lonesome at the ford. It was Saturday, and Laura had not played with him. It would be a whole week before they would have another day of playing along Plum Creek. They told Ma all about the party, and she said, "We must not accept hospitality without making some return. I've been thinking about it, girls, and you must ask Nellie Oleson and the others to a party here. I think a week from Saturday.